I will be reading from Hebrews chapter 13, verses 1 through 3. And if you're sore now, Kenny, wait until tomorrow. It catches up to you real quick. Longer when you're older. Keep on loving each other as brothers. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by doing so, some people have entertained angels without knowing it. Remember those in prison, as if you were their fellow prisoners, and those who are mistreated, as if yourselves were suffering.
Well, good morning, Lakeview. It's a beautiful morning, but I hope more than that, I hope you're glad to be here joined together with the family of God. It has been an exciting last month and a half for our congregation because we've seen a handful of baptisms. We've seen a number of families now place membership with us. And just in general, that's kind of an exciting thing to see. If you're here and you've been baptized recently, I want you to know you will never regret choosing Jesus Christ. Amen. You will not. And if you're here and you've recently placed a membership with us at Lakeview, I want to tell you, it's easy to get lost in the crowd. And if I've introduced myself to you 5 or 6 times, that's just who I am. But I'm thankful that you're here. And I pray that you find, while you're here at Lakeview, you find a congregation that loves you, that embraces you, that supports you, and lifts you up to the Father regularly, because that's who we want to be for you. So I hope that when you gather here, I hope that you're surrounded by friends and you're surrounded by family. And I pray that we are a blessing to you at this congregation. I want to take a look at a text in Acts chapter 2. I want us to start actually right there at the very beginning of the church. Acts chapter 2 is probably a really famous text. A lot of us are familiar. We go to Acts chapter 2 whenever we want to preach about baptism. But there's more there than just a lesson on baptism. In the book of Acts, we have there at the very beginning, Jesus had finished his earthly ministry. He had lingered with the apostles for a bit. He was taken up, and he told them to stay in Jerusalem and to wait. And finally, on the day of Pentecost, when there were a handful of them gathered together, it happened. With crowds all around, Peter got up and spoke. Everyone got the attention of everyone around. They were speaking in tongues and languages they had never known. Peter got up and he gave the very first gospel sermon, and it is the one that every preacher tries to recreate when they get up in front of people, because he gets there, he preaches, he convicts people of their sin, they respond. 3,000 people, it says, were added to their number that day, and there you have the very first mega church. Mega churches, notoriously, churches where nobody can connect and everybody is lost and they all come as strangers and they leave as strangers. 3,000 people were added to their number that day, and this is what he says in Acts chapter 2, starting with verse 41. So those who received his word were baptized, and they were added that day about 3,000 souls. Verse 42. And they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, and to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles, and all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributed the proceeds to all, any as he had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. Okay. I know this is going to sound like a strange question, But here we have the establishment of the church, right? And it launches with this great sermon, and people are responding. The Spirit is moving. People are spending time with each other day and night, right? They're together in the temple. They're together in each other's homes. They're together in the public courts. They're praising God. They're learning from the apostles. There's teaching. There's breaking of bread, right? The church has this rich idea of fellowship that we wish we saw in every church we had ever worshiped in, right? You see this rich tapestry of fellowship. And the one thing that it never talks about in Acts chapter 2, in fact, actually, very rarely all throughout the Bible does it talk about this. What do you suppose worship was like for that group of believers? I'll bet it was incredible. I'll bet it was absolutely incredible. And I'm not talking about the conversation that you and I get into when we talk about pedantic things about worship. Well, should there be instruments? Should there not? How many songs should there be? How long should the preacher go? He goes this long. He should really go this long. We're not talking about all Paul preached until somebody fell out of a window. I'm just saying. Just putting that out there. But all of these petty things that we talk about for worship, and yet in the context, reading through this rich fellowship of Acts chapter 2, how they spent time with each other, home to home. They sold their possessions so those who did not have then had something. How they had all things in common, and everyone spoke well of them as they were teaching and meeting together in the temple, in each other's homes, breaking bread with one another. What was their worship like? He doesn't have to say anything about their worship for me to tell you this. It was incredible. And I don't know how many songs there were. And I don't know what style of preaching was used. But I know that it was passionate and incredible because the people who gathered together on Sunday morning were celebrating the way their lives were being shared throughout the week. The rest was icing on the cake. You know probably that I garden occasionally. The very first time I discovered a grub worm in my yard, I had no idea what it was. All I knew is that I had some plants, and every gardener deep down is a little bit, tiny bit competitive with other gardeners. And so, if we're both growing tomatoes, mine need to be bigger than yours, and mine need to be growing better, and mine need to be healthier than yours. And I noticed that a bunch of my greens were not growing as quickly as my neighbor's greens were growing. And I thought, this is strange. And so I did what every young budding gardener did. I spent 8 hours researching online, and then I spent 2 minutes fertilizing the plants. Grow! And they did not grow. In fact, just the opposite. A couple days later, they started looking wilty and sad, and all the leaves laid flat, and I thought, I know what this is. I need to water more. And so I watered, and I watered, and I watered, and I watered, and I tended the plant, and I fertilized, and I watered, and absolutely nothing was fixing the problem until I bumped the plant, and it fell over. Because it had absolutely no root at all. That's what a grub worm does. And what's amazing is I had no idea what was going on under the surface, because to me it looked like a healthy plant. Maybe it needed a little bit of work here and there, but it looked like a healthy plant until the entire root was eaten up and it was eroded and it just simply fell over. I believe that you and I can experience this moment in a number of different ways. And if you're a member of Lakeview and you have this rich tapestry of fellowship where you're spending time with your brothers and sisters, you gather together on Sunday morning and it looks the same as somebody else, but it is this rich, healthy, vibrant fellowship that is exciting to be a part of. But you can also gather together, experience the same worship, the same thing that looks the same as everyone else, and then walk, leaving empty and starved and dying. Last week, the elders and preachers met together. We had a fantastic meeting, and we spent several hours talking, dreaming, sharing, planning, praying about this congregation. And there was one point in time in that meeting where we went around and we shared what our experiences were those moments when church was the place where our cups were filled, where we were experiencing church the way we want it to be experienced. And to a man, every one of us said, oh, it was this time when we were doing this, and we were doing this together, and we were doing this together, and we were doing this together. And as we went through and we shared, we ended up sharing these experiences in church that actually didn't center around Sunday morning at all. It centered around our experiences and our fellowship with each other, it being involved in different ministries, being engaged in each other's homes. And honestly, the lifeblood, the pulse of most of what we experienced as a healthy church experience is going to a person's home or having people over to our home. And at that moment, to a man, every one of us realized that this healthy moment in a church is when we look around and we gather here on Sunday morning and we recognize that these are my people. This is a place that I belong, but it's not because of what happens on Sunday morning. It's because of what happens on Monday night, or Tuesday, or Wednesday, or Thursday, or Friday. And we shared, and we dreamed, we prayed, and every one of us, to a man, wants this for you. We want this for us at Lakeview. Not that this is a place where a group of strangers gather together, they spend an hour, and then they leave. But it's a place where we come, we gather around, we look, and we say, this is where I belong. These are my people. Which launched me to take a look at a couple things in the Bible. Areas that I've not actually really studied in any depth, and I kind of want to share them with you because this was new for me to a certain degree. Hebrews chapter 13. This is a text everybody goes to, right? When you want to talk about this rich experience, you've got this command in Hebrews chapter 13 about showing hospitality and entertaining strangers and this weird thing about angels. And most of the time when we go to Hebrews chapter 13, we end up getting parked on the whole angels text. And I think that we kind of get sidelined from seeing maybe the bigger ideas, right? He says in Hebrews chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unaware. So I think the writer of Hebrews looks back on the entire Jewish faith and he says, there have been about half a dozen times people have encountered angels and they have not even realized that they were angels, but the way they treated them was important, right? But what he says at the beginning is, this is the instruction. He says, let brotherly love continue and do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers. I want to unpack those two words because sometimes we don't know what's in those words. Okay, so that word, brotherly love, actually comes from one word. It's actually Greek. It's the word Philadelphia. It's a combination of two words. Phileo, which is a word for love, and Adelphia, which is a word for brothers. And that's why our city, Philadelphia, is very unoriginal with its tagline, the city of brotherly love. But the other word that's used here is this word. He says, do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers. There are not a bunch of words there. He's not saying show hospitality and, oh, by the way, do that to strangers. This word for hospitality, as it's used throughout the Bible in many places, actually is a combination of two words. The same word for love, for brotherly love, phileo, and xenos, strangers. xenophobia is the fear of strangers. Okay, all right. So here's what he's saying in Hebrews chapter 13. He says, let love within the brotherhood continue. Show love towards your brothers. Oh, and do not neglect to show hospitality. But that word for hospitality is not just inviting anyone over that you want to invite. It's specifically invite strangers over. Showing hospitality is inviting somebody that you do not know. And I thought, well, that's strange. See, in Hebrews chapter 13, the sentence would be really short if they just said hospitality. So they said, show hospitality to strangers. But that word, philoxena, is actually used consistently as that word for hospitality. Does the Bible have anything else to say about what it is to be hospitable? It does. In fact, for all of the, a couple years ago, we did an elder search, right? And we asked for the congregation to look among us for deacons and elders who are qualified. And we found some men who were qualified to serve as deacons, men who were qualified to serve as elders. And every time I've ever been involved in this process, people start wringing their hands about how many children they have and whether they're believers, right? And all the other expectations of what an elder is supposed to be seem to not be important. In both texts, in 1 Timothy and in Titus, Paul tells us that an elder must be a man who is hospitable. In other words, a man who shows love to strangers, specifically a person who invites in people that he does not regularly know. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. Titus chapter 1, for an overseer, as God's steward, must be above reproach. He must not be arrogant or quick-tempered or a drunkard or violent or greedy for gain, but hospitable, a lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. And those two lists are not exactly the same. In fact, there's a lot of latitude as they wander around each other, but they hit on just a couple points that are the same. Hospitality is one of those. It is so important that there's even this text in 1 Timothy chapter 5. Nobody talks about the order of widows, the list of widows, right? And we don't have a really good grasp on what the relationship is like with widows. We know that there are women who are added to a list, and the church helped to support these widows. And it seems like there were expectations for how these widows also in turn served the church. But regardless of what that is, Paul gives instructions in 1 Timothy about whether or not somebody's allowed to be on this list, allowed to receive funding from the congregation, and who they ought to be. And he says, let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband and having the reputation for good works, if she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the... I'm actually thankful that he's not saying, and she still shows hospitality, because stranger danger. But has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work. In other words, if the church is going to be associated with these women, they're going to help support their life, their ministry here as widows, we still need to look for this same pattern. Are they a person who, when they were younger, were inviting people into their homes? Now, here's why this is important. Because right up until I looked at Hebrews chapter 13, I thought that this idea of hospitality is something that maybe the church sometimes could preach on and could use a nudge as an encouragement. And the more I started studying Hebrews chapter 13, 1 Peter chapter 4, 1 Timothy chapter 2, Titus chapter 1, the more I realize that the Bible spends so much time commanding from us hospitality. Commanding from us hospitality. That I think the church has spent decades punting on this. I don't think preachers preach about it with the same force that Scripture talks about it. I don't think we talk about it among each other. And we definitely don't, we definitely believe, at least this morning before you came here and you heard me preaching about this, you certainly believe that hospitality is maybe a gift, but not a command, right? It's something that some people do, but other people don't have to. I can't show hospitality because I'm not an extrovert. I don't have a big enough house. I don't have money to feed those people. Right? Well, your life is never going to be perfect to have people over. And if it is, are you really sharing your life with somebody else? Hospitality, showing love for strangers, is actually a command in Scripture. So, why is it so important? It's important because if you didn't go to junior high, you might have missed the memo. Who you sit with in the lunchroom defines who you are. Come on. I still get anxiety if I go to a school and I try to figure out which group I'm going to sit with, right? I'm an adult. I'm on the other side of this whole thing. I'm cool all by myself. And I still try to find the cool kid table, right? Okay. This is so important that in an ancient worldview, you can actually take the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and you can structure the entire Gospel of Luke based on who Jesus eats with and what he does when he's eating with them. In fact, you can structure the entire arc, the collapse of Jesus' ministry and the accusation of who he is based on who he eats with. If you've never done this, this will open your eyes, okay? Let me just show you the meals that Jesus eats. Some of these are implied. It doesn't explicitly say a meal, but most of them, it explicitly says a meal. I know. Little font. I wanted to fit it all on one. All right, so in chapter 5, you have the very first time Jesus is invited to eat out at somebody's house. It's Levi's house, a tax collector. After he invited Levi to become a disciple, he threw this big party. He went over to Levi's house, and we find the very first time Jesus receives this accusation. He went to the wrong table to eat. And the Pharisees and their scribes grumbled at his disciples, saying, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" It's not the last time Jesus is going to be accused of doing this, but you'd be surprised how infrequently he did it. In chapter 7, he goes to a Pharisee's house where there is Simon, and oh yeah, there was a sinner there. Talks about that. Chapter 9, the feeding of the 5,000, where literally everyone is there. Chapter 10, Mary and Martha. He's in Mary and Martha's house. There's a meal there. Chapter 11, he's at another Pharisee's house where there's yet another trap with another sinner that he has to navigate through. There's chapter 14, the Sabbath with the Pharisees. There's a man with dropsy. He has to navigate through that. And in chapter 14, Jesus spends a lot of time talking about who you eat with. It's not just a meal there. It's suddenly the context for talking about what is and is not important in the kingdom of God. And so he gives this parable about a wedding banquet and how important it is for everybody to attend the wedding banquet, but they all say, "Gee, no, I'm really too busy." And then at the end of that, the scribes and Pharisees heard that and they felt a little bit convicted, like maybe he was talking about them. He was. And so they changed the topic and they said, "But it'll be great when we're all sitting around at the banquet table in heaven." And Jesus says, "Or maybe you won't," right? And then just one chapter later, the Pharisees and the scribes are grumbling again that this man receives sinners and eats with them. And he hasn't done that since chapter 5. Chapter 19, you have the story of Zacchaeus. He does it again finally. He eats with a sinner. And then you have the Last Supper. And then you have chapter 24 where Jesus comes back. He's risen. He reveals himself to people when he breaks bread. And then in chapter 24, towards the end, he actually has his last supper with them before he's taken up. Luke, the Gospel of Luke, can be structured, outlined with every significant moment in Jesus' ministry happening before, after, or in some orientation to a meal. But this phrase, he eats and drinks with tax collectors and sinners, haunts Jesus for his whole ministry. Why does it haunt him? Because who you spend time with at a dinner table says something about who you are in relationship with. It always has. Sometimes it's more formalized than at other times, but who you sit with at a dinner table communicates who you are in relationship with. That's why that was such a barb. Look at Jesus in relationship with these people. Hospitality is important because where you sit in a lunchroom is important. As I was doing some research for this lesson, and by the way, I'm also teaching a class in Galatians for our young professionals. So this has kind of been a little bit fun of an Easter egg to find as I was studying for this text. Okay, so in the book of Galatians, Paul and Peter definitely have a conflict. It's described in Galatians chapter 2. It kind of runs a current throughout the entire book of Galatians and a couple other places. Specifically, the conflict was whether or not Peter was okay to eat with people who had not been circumcised. Galatians chapter 2, Paul recounts it like this. He says in Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, "But when Cephas," this is Peter, "when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself." Right, about 15 years later, Peter writes the book of 1 Peter. In 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 8 and 9, he says this. This is instruction to all the churches as he's writing. He says, "Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers a multitude of sins. Show hospitality." Do you remember what that word for hospitality is? Show a love for strangers, right? Show a love for strangers toward one another without grumbling. Okay, so I don't know all the gritty details. I know that at one point in time, if you read through the book of Acts, it's clear that Peter is an advocate for the inclusion of Gentiles in the church. He speaks about that in Acts chapter 15. But there was some point in time where Peter and Paul locked horns. And specifically, it was not about what happened when the church gathered together. It was about what was happening when the church was not together. And for Paul, this is so fundamental to the case of the gospel that there are other places in Galatians where he describes this kind of behavior, not eating with the uncircumcised Christians. This kind of behavior, not eating with some people but eating with others, is a threat to the very gospel itself. Right? So he challenges Peter and he says, "I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned before certain men came from James. He was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself." And so Peter, 15 years later, writes, "Love covers a multitude of sins. Show love for strangers towards one another without grumbling." Show hospitality to your brothers and sisters that you do not know. It's important. It's important for us to teach and preach and practice hospitality, because this moment, Sunday morning, is affected by Monday evening and Thursday evening and Friday evening. And if you had a chance to read the title of my lesson, you'll already know where I'm going with this. I believe that your worship on Sunday morning needs entertainment. It will enhance your worship. Have people over. Show hospitality. Entertain strangers. And he's not just talking about strangers. He's talking about strangers. We get that one down, and maybe we figure out how the first mega church in the entire world seemed to get along and have this rich fellowship with one another. Let me go back to that one thing that I was saying a little bit earlier, talking about that meeting. It is the desire of this leadership, every one of us, that this is a place where you come and gather on Sunday morning, and you believe you are surrounded by people who are your people, that you belong. But that only happens if we pay attention to what happens on the other days of the week. That will enhance your Sunday morning. That will make this a rich, sweet time for God's people to be together. Some churches are filled with people who come and they're strangers when they come, they're strangers when they go. Even worse than that, sometimes Sunday morning, instead of being this blessing of people gathering together, it's actually a curse to people. Because sometimes Sunday morning becomes the moment where a group of strangers get together and a group of strangers leave, and they're not living their lives together. They're not exercising hospitality. They're not spending time with each other. And then this moment on Sunday morning, instead of becoming just a group of strangers, it actually becomes cannibalistic as people start becoming suspicious of each other, gossiping and backbiting. This can actually become a problem if the rest is not intact. It's like that plant that looks right but withers and drops right over because the roots are gone. Without irony, mind you, Paul is writing to the most dysfunctional church in the book of 1 Corinthians, right? And it's a church that's absolutely fractured in every way. And I have no question in my mind that what they're lacking is not on Sunday morning, but it's every other day of the week. And he writes to them, and he's talking about this one moment where they're having a dysfunction in the Lord's Supper, and he says, "Do you not have homes to eat and drink in?" As if to say, the problem on Sunday morning is happening because nothing else is happening the rest of the week. And here's what this means for us at Lakeview. It's true of this congregation, and it's true of almost every other church I've worshiped with. People crave opportunities to get together. They do. They do. We're built for community, and we're built to live life with each other. But it's a struggle for me in ministry because it manifests itself in this way. I get people who regularly come up and say, Ben, we need more potlucks. Ben, we need more programming where we get to go together. And by the way, if you're interested in that, picnic, 2 weeks, Point Defiance, right? That's my plug right there. Okay. If you're interested in that, finding people at this congregation to connect with. If you feel like you're gathering with a group of strangers, show up. It's not at your house, right? Okay, that's my pitch there. And if you already do feel connected, maybe take this idea of hospitality to heart and find somebody that you don't know and connect with them over there too, right? Okay, but the problem is that when we try to figure this out as a church, we always think about programming. Let's do a picnic together. Let's do a potluck together. Let's do this. Let's do this. Let's do this. And those are all great things, but let me be really candid. They're not the biblical answer. The biblical answer, found all throughout the New Testament, is that you invite somebody to your house. You invite somebody you don't know well to your house. Now here's the good news. I know that there are people here who don't feel connected. They look around and this isn't necessarily their place or their group of people. What you do with that is important because you can decide, I don't know, this church seems to be happy with everyone else, but they seem to not notice me, right? Ever get stuck in the blues thinking about why you haven't been invited over to somebody's house, right? The command wasn't for them, it was for you. And that's the strange thing. If you feel this disconnection with the fellowship and the family of God, the answer, you hold the answer. And if you're waiting for your life to be perfect, right? Where your kid's room is cleaned up, that's not going to happen. Can I get an amen? If you're waiting for your basement not to be blown up, that's probably not going to happen either. If you're waiting till you live closer to the neighbors you want to invite, that might not happen either. But you'd be amazed how far I'm willing to drive for good food. Not that I need to drive anywhere for good food because it's right at my house too. I'm just going to go on record for saying my wife is a fantastic cook, and I'm just going to leave it at that. This is not somebody else's job. It's your job, and it's my job. And if you feel unconnected and God has given you a place to invite people to, can I encourage you to use it? And that's the pulse of this congregation. And I've been amazed because I've been blessed on both sides of that. When I have people over, I feel more connected with them. When they have me over, I feel more connected with them. And it really doesn't matter whether I'm hosting or they are. Can I encourage you to think that maybe you're the solution to the problem instead of somebody else being? And if this sounds really intimidating to you because you're not an extrovert, there are some people in this congregation, and I'm not joking, who are incredibly gifted at this. I mean, they're really good at this. Their home is open. You feel welcome. You've never met them before, but you feel like you've known them for 20 years, right? If you know somebody in this congregation who has this down, can I encourage you to find them? I mean, like, even be candid about this and say, I don't know how to do this well. How do you do it? I mean, what does this look like? Maybe lower your standards, and instead of trying to project a perfect household, because we all know it's not, just accept that this is who you are and you're sharing your life with your brothers and sisters. You might find that you actually enjoy your relationship with them more if they know your kids' rooms are messy than if they have to be perfect. And this one is important, so hear this too. You know, regarding the mission of the church, we believe that the invitation, we're going to invite people to church, invite people to church, invite people to Jesus, invite people to Jesus. We invite them to submit their life to the foot of the cross. And I'm telling you, in almost every case, before they receive the invitation to come to the foot of the cross, they've received the invitation to come to a person's house. And so if you want to talk about why hospitality is important, it's important because it is the lifeblood of any church. We get this down, and there's no need to fix Sunday morning worship because it's incredible. It's a moment of sweet reunion where brothers and sisters cannot help but want to be with each other. And if this has not been you up until this point, consider it. And let me double back here to that one moment. It is the church's mission for you to not just know your brothers and sisters. This makes this moment sweet, but it's so that we can point to a God that loves you, a Father that gives you a sweet embrace, a place where you belong. And so with that in mind, I want to offer an opportunity for you to respond, because if this has never been a part of your life, I am telling you, you're missing out. When the church is described as the family of God, it is a family. It is a group of people who will stick by you and love you through your warts and all. And if you've never responded to the invitation, you don't know what it looks like to put on Christ in baptism, I encourage you to respond, to begin studying. And if you're here but you're aloof and you need to make a change in how you're invested in the body at Lakeview, you can respond to this invitation too. But if you need the prayers of the church, you need direction, you need encouragement, this church has been blessed with several shepherds who actively are involved in the life of the congregation. And if you need to respond, you're going to find them as we stand and sing the song. You're going to find them at the back of the aisles. I encourage you to go find them, offer up prayers with them, and ask how you can be more involved. If you need to respond for any reason, please let them know as we stand and sing the song.